This week, we're going to be doing an overview of fantastic literature. And fantastic literature is a larger term that encompasses science fiction, fantasy, steampunk, and a range of other genres. So we saw this when we were talking about transactional theory and the importance of entering the secondary world, which I had told you at that time actually came from Tolkien. And Tolkien, his statement being, "Children are capable, of course, of literary belief. When the storymaker's art is good enough to produce it, the state of mind has been called willing suspension of disbelief. But this does not seem to me a good description of what happens. What really happens is that the storymaker proves a successful sub-creator. He makes a secondary world which your mind can enter. Inside it, what he relates is true. It accords with the laws of the world. You therefore believe it, while you are, as it were, inside it. The suspension of disbelief is a substitute for the genuine thing. A real enthusiast is an enchanted state. Secondary belief." So it's very much about, especially in an imaginary world, being able to enter that world and to stay within it. So fantastic literature, which can encompass, as I said, science fiction, fantasy. A Wrinkle in Time is actually science fantasy, animal fantasy. So fantastic literature, imaginative narratives that explore alternative realities. An imaginary world unlike the one we know, either completely different or with striking different elements. Events we experience that could not take place in the known world, with a reality that does not map onto the observable world as we know it, defying known laws of physics and science. Contains some element, character, setting, or plot that is not found in the real world. This could include elements of the magic or supernatural. So fantasy. Fantasy is rooted in folklore. A lot of themes, stock plots, stock characters reflect folklore. For instance, many reference ancient myths and legends. Harry Potter, Percy Jackson and the Olympians, Troy. Can you think of any others? If you can, write them down and bring them to class. So distinctions from folklore. It is not oral in nature, but written down, longer, and more complex. So in folklore, if you remember, there was a clear antagonist and a clear protagonist. That's not so in fantasy and science fiction and fantastic literature in general. There's a lot of gray area. Fantasy versus folklore. So folklore is black and white, good guys versus bad guys. We know who is good and who is bad. Fantasy is varying shades of gray. It explores the ambiguities of life. I'm not sure how many of you have read The Tale of Despereaux. It's a really great novel. Not so much a fan of the movie, but the novel is really, really awesome. And in it, Despereaux, a very small mouse, is trying to be the hero, but he can't. He keeps messing up. And then he has his villain counterpart, a rat. But at the same time, when we hear the rat story, we also learn that he was mistreated. So the rat is far more complicated than just being a mean antagonist for no reason. There's a reason that he is an antagonist. And he's far more complex than just the witch in Snow White. Fantasy. Often the first literature that children experience through talking animal stories, such as Winnie the Pooh, Toad and Frog, Charlotte's Web. Fantastic literature, high versus low. These terms often are used, and sometimes are used to connote one thing, and sometimes are used to connote another thing. High fantasy versus low fantasy. This is one way of looking at it. Low fantasy. Set in the primary world we live in. High fantasy often occurs in secondary world where non-rational causality is postulated. Physical laws govern the secondary world. So low fantasy would be like Harry Potter, because Harry Potter goes between both worlds, the world of the Muggles, and goes, and then the world of the wizards. So it would be considered low fantasy. The seriousness of the questions that are asked and the possibilities that are posed range from light fantasy to high fantasy, and from science fiction based on futuristic creatures or inventions to that based on profound changes in our world. So some people will use light fantasy to high fantasy because low fantasy has a connotation that it's not good. So some people be like, well, low fantasy means they're not dealing with a lot of, important subjects. That's not really what the term is supposed to note. So now they'll say light fantasy. So light fantasy meaning it's not, dealing with big human world issues, and the profundity is what makes it high fantasy. So the terminology gets a little mixed up and can get confusing. So devices such as time slips, magic objects, magic beings help create fantasy. So there are different types of fantasy. There's animal fantasy, high fantasy, low fantasy, science fantasy, miniature worlds, literary lore, quest tales, and alternative universe. Also steampunk. So there are I have several like different kinds of pictures up there that we can match up, but we'll just do a couple. See the Smurfs in the left hand corner. Which would you Today's fantasy and science fiction often deal with the complexities of existence. Reading it can be a significant experience, building readers' values and beliefs. Grand themes: good versus evil, life and death, courage versus fear, love and hate, what it means to be human, consequences of pride. I've also had a lot of students notice the struggles between light and dark, and have often made claims about that in terms of their belief systems and, good against evil, and how that translates into their own value system, their own moral compass. Evaluating the criteria for excellence in narrative fiction. The fantasy or future world is detailed and believable within the context of the story. The story events are imaginative, yet logically consistent within the story world. It has to be logical. Not logical in our world, but logical in their world. So if the author's setting is a world in which everybody has microchips in their head, there needs to also be somebody who can invent the microchips, and it should be consistent with the fact, how are they talking to one another? How is this world functioning? They don't need to have, like, if there's landlines, it's a little weird. Why do you need a landline phone if you can just use your brain to try to get somebody over the internet? So it needs to be consistent. The characters are multidimensional with consistent logical behavior. The writing is rich and structures are clear. The themes are meaningful, causing readers to think about life. For a while, fantasy and science fiction have gotten looked down upon and not held up to the standards of what people, quote unquote, called literature. But in reality, they should be just as much in quality in terms of the multidimensionality of the characters and the richness of the writing. So the setting. Rich details that enable readers to envision time and place, usually the future in science fiction, alternative realities, often with maps supplied, or fantasy accepted in real world, or a combination of both. Can act as antagonist, symbol, or illuminate characters. And there I have The Hobbit and the Hobbit map. And many fantasy books will come with the map, because when it's that vividly written, you follow them from the Shire to Middle-earth to wherever, and each place you should be able to envision in your head, and the map is something that builds that world for you or helps you live in that world. Evaluating the fantastic setting. Readers may be led into the fantasy world through some sort of device. A door, like in Coraline. A magic object, such as The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. The wardrobe is the entrance into the fantasy world. Harry Potter, platform 9 3/4. The train is a device that moves the reader from the real world to the fantasy world. So when there are two worlds, again, this is often considered what people might call low fantasy. And again, that's not being judgmental on it being of non-quality. It's just, that's the terminology that's come up over the years to explain fantasy, where it's not, there's no complete secondary world, that there's movement between two worlds. That of the everyday and that of the fantastic. Readers can be led into the alternative reality through some object, or through the belief of realistic characters in the fantasy setting, or through the extrapolation of scientific possibilities into a future world. Plot. Even though events may not be realistic, what happens must be logically consistent within the story world. If characters move through time, they do so for a reason. If the fantastic operates in the real world, there must be consistency in how real people are affected by fantastic events. So here we have a classic story, The Time Machine. In science fiction, the consequences of the particular scientific advances drive the plot. So in The Time Machine, he goes back in time and through the future to see what the world has to bring, and ends up meeting the Eloi, and making conclusions about pretty much how man ends up destroying the world. But the time machine needs to have existed. He must have built the time machine, or there would have been no way, no device for him to move about in time and be exposed Both human and non-human characters should be recognizable beings with strong emotions. Main characters are multidimensional personalities. They behave consistently, respond to events in believable fashion, grow and change across the course of the story. If a character that lives in a realistic world enters a fantasy situation, the character remains consistent across both worlds. So while Harry Potter might be in the real world, he's still a bit of a nerd when he being a wizard. It doesn't completely change his personality. You want to be able to follow those characters. You don't want to lose transition the different worlds. Mirrors and windows. So this is something. Or if you read The Ear, the Eye, and the Arm, what is the value of teaching fantastic literature? So fantastic the arrival. I hope that you'll dig deep enough into it to see those issues and bring them out in some response. It expands the imagination, considers wonder, fosters thinking about values and ideals, offers wonderful stories about outstanding writers to stretch the soul. So, we'll talk about it a lot more in class. I hope you enjoy reading The Arrival this week, and I